If you're looking for a painting project, then you may want to do this step-by-step magnolia flower where I'll show you how to paint these muted, subtle tones. Okay, and welcome to my studio. You can see that I've done a really simple outline of the magnolia flower, and I'll explain to you later on how you can access a free version of the trace down as well as the reference photograph. This is how I trace down my drawings for speed, but you can of course do them freehand if you want to. So let me just talk you quickly through the materials I'm using today. The paints are by Schmincke, ruby red, lemon yellow hue, neutral tint, sepia, and I'm also going to be using buff titanium by Daniel Smith, and bleed-proof white by Dr. P.H. Martins towards the end. The brushes I've chosen today are a flat synthetic brush from Rosemary Co to do the blending and lifting out if needed, and my very old spotter that's got a blunt tip which I use for mixing my paints. Don't use your good brushes for doing that. And I really like this kind of travel brush by Da Vinci. All the materials I will link in the description box underneath this video, and the paper that I'm going to be using today is this beautiful sketchbook by Etcher that has 100% cotton paper, and it's a cold press surface, which means it has some texture. So I have a really beautiful ceramic palette here from Etcher, which I really love using. I've recently bought this to mix my colours, and the colour chart that I always use to match my colours up, which really helps colour matching. And if you'd like to make your own, I've done a similar video which I will link above. So let's start by putting our base colours into the magnolia flower like this. I'm going to do 2 watery puddles of buff titanium, and I'm going to be adding ruby red to the other. Now, I always say this in my videos, if you don't have the colours that I'm using, please use the nearest that you have within your own kit, because invariably you will have something similar yourself. So to start with, I'm going to be using my number 5 round, working wet in wet, which simply means I'll be applying the water where I want to drop the paint. Notice how I've got a tiny puddle of water in the centre of my palette. It just helps control the application of the water, because if I were to dip my brush in my jar, which is on the side here, it would flood the brush with water and make it a little less easy to control. So just a little bit of a tip there, add a separate puddle on a smaller surface of your palette just to help control your paint. When I've applied the water where I want to drop the paint, you can see me here dropping in the buff titanium, and it's a really watery mix. As you can see, we want this to be our base colour. If you are new to watercolour painting, it's all about building up your layers slowly and carefully so that you don't overwork your painting. You do need a little bit of patience to let your layers dry in between applications, but at the moment we're working wet in wet, so I'm dropping in the pink mix, as you can see here, letting it sort of naturally blur into the buff titanium colour that we've applied as our base coat. Notice how I'm using the tip of my number 5 brush just to move the paint where I want it to go. Because we've wet the paper to begin with, it makes this super easy to control. Just using the tip of my number 5 round. I'm just dropping in the buff titanium here again, wet on wet. Notice how light the colour is at this stage. I've chosen to use buff titanium because ordinarily I might have just used the paper as the creamy colour, but I did feel that this magnolia had this beautiful, soft, delicate, kind of creamy look to it, which is why I've used this colour. I'm just using wet on dry application method here just to paint that first wash onto that petal there, and using the wet on wet technique for the other petals. Just carry on working through, wet on wet, dropping in that buff titanium. As the paint settles into the paper, notice how I'm using my brush just to move it up to that pencil line. That gives a really nice sharp outside edge. Okay, now that everything's completely dry, I've cleaned down my palette, and notice how I'm using the tip of my brush here just to move that paint up to that pencil line. As watercolour dries, it retracts a little bit from that edge, and this is just a way of manipulating that paint back into place. I've cleaned down my palette and I'm mixing two petals here. We've got neutral tint and neutral tint with sepia. Notice how watery they are. I'm using the neutral tint mix on its own to apply this wet on dry, so make sure that your layers are dry before you do this. I'm cleaning my brush in that tiny little puddle of water that I have on my palette, patting it dry on the kitchen paper and just blending it through. I use this method of application a lot in my paintings, and I have done a separate video on this, so I will link it on the top of your screen right now. So if you want to take a look at that, you can click through and watch it after this video. Using my reference photograph as a guide, and because you've all asked me to do it, I've decided to keep the reference photograph in screen for further tutorials. Speaking of reference photographs and line drawings, you can have free access to line drawings and reference photographs if you join our Facebook group. We are an amazing community over there, and you can post your finished paintings there if you want to, and of course have free access to line drawings and reference photographs that accompany our tutorials here on YouTube. So all you need to do is click through, answer a few questions, which is usual, and join up and say hello to our other lovely members over there. I'll also put a line drawing at the end of this video, so if you want to do a screenshot and you're not on Facebook, you can access it that way. So this is the neutral tint, which I'm using wet on dry to apply over that light shadow area. Now you'll notice that the area that I'm painting has darker elements to it, but this is the lightest tone that we see. So using that number 5 round, or any brush that you have with a fine point, apply wet on dry to this area that you can see me applying the paint. Notice how I'm constantly patting my brush on the kitchen paper as I work through, so that there isn't too much pigment on there. So now that that first element has dried, I'm using a mixture of the neutral tint along with sepia to apply to this area here, which is in shadow. Now of course it isn't dark enough yet, because we are going to be building up our colours as we work through. By applying watercolour in this way, it prevents our work from becoming overworked and muddy. So just apply your colours slowly and carefully, making sure that each layer is dry before you apply the next. Notice how I'm using my brush in a kind of pattern motion to apply the paint. Because this paper is slightly textured, it just makes the application a little bit easier by patting that paint into the paper. So here we have neutral tints, and I'm applying this to the shadow area, which I've penciled in lightly here. So I'm just using my tiny puddle of water to work wet in wet and dropping in that sepia. We want to keep the colours really subtle and soft for these muted tones in this pretty magnolia flower, so keep them as light as you can as you work through. We want it to look really delicate and soft. Notice at the base of this petal there's a lighter area, and we want to try and keep out of that if we can. And the same on the other petal here. Just dropping in those tones as you can see. Now we are using the reference photograph just as a guide. I'm not going to be exactly photo accurate. It isn't a fine art tutorial. It's just enjoying how to sort of apply your paint and learn how to paint this pretty magnolia. So we are just using it as a sort of rough guide. So just be mindful that not all the elements will be exactly the same, but it'll give you an idea of what to follow and how to apply your paint. So notice once again, I'm keeping out of that lighter area at the base of the petal and just dropping in the pigments where I roughly think they need to go. You can see how I'm using the damp brush to soften that hard edge there, and the same on the bottom. And just by using that damp brush, it just really softens out that outside edge. Okay, once again everything's dry. I'm using my flat synthetic brush here, and it's used damp, by which I mean I'm just cleaning it in some water and patting it on my kitchen paper. And just by using that damp brush, you can see how it softens out those hard edges, blurring those colours together really, really softly to get rid of that hard edge that we get when watercolour dries. Okay, I am now mixing some ruby red with buff titanium and a tiny bit of sepia. So we have 3 separate petals here like this. We have this sort of gentle muted pink tone. And once again, I'm working wet on wet, picking up that tiny little puddle of water from my palette. Once I've applied that water, once again I'm dropping in my pink pigments, as you can see, dipping between them on my palette. You'll notice that there's a tiny little area of white at the top outside edge of this petal where it joins the other one. And you saw me there just dropping in the darker of the 2 pinks. Now I'm working wet on dry, using that mix of neutral tint with sepia to apply the paint like this. There's a tiny little element of pink in that as well, drawn with my paintbrush some tiny little veins. So here you can see me applying the mix of neutral tint, ruby red and sepia to this little petal that's in shadow here, once again working this time wet on dry. Just using the tip of my brush to push that paint where I want it to go. And I just noticed when I was painting this that I did make a slight error in the center here where I've done my drawing, but not to worry, we can sort that out later. Where that petal folds over, I don't think I've done the line in quite the right place, but not to worry. Okay, so once again, building up our layers, wet on wet, using this beautiful pinky tone to remind you once again it's ruby red with buff titanium, and I'm applying this tiny little area here where we can see that tiny little pink shadow where the petals overlap, and using that damp brush to blur those outside edges. And dropping in that tone. So you can keep building up these colours slowly and carefully to get the depth of colour and tone that you want. Remember that tonal values are just as important as colour, so just be mindful as you work through the tutorial that your tones will also need to change as well as your colour. Applying that pink tone to the outside edge of this petal. Cleaning my brush and my tiny little puddle that's almost disappeared on my palette now. And adding some pink tone to the fold of the outside edge of this petal here. Make sure though that that shadow petal that we've just painted in is completely dry. And just adding a tiny bit of pink to the bottom element there. And I did feel there was a sort of slight pinky hue to this element of that shadow, so I'm just applying this as you can see. So if you are enjoying this video, you may want to consider subscribing and hitting that bell to stay up to date. And we are also on Instagram at The Wonders of Watercolour, so do join us there. I just want to take a moment to tell you about our Patreon, which at the time of filming has 4 different membership levels, from mini weekly videos of doodles, vlogs and podcasts to full-length botanical painting tutorials, which are exclusive to Patreon and are of course ad-free. If this is something that interests you, I've put a link in the description below, plus it's a way for you to support my channel. Okay, back to the tutorial. You can see I'm using my flat synthetic brush here once again to soften out those hard edges where the paint has dried. So once again, now that everything's dry, let's focus our attention on the center part of the magnolia. So we have ruby red with buff titanium and also a tiny bit of the sepia and a separate petal of that lovely lemon yellow hue. So I'm working this time wet on dry, dropping in that colour to start with and then adding the pink tone as you can see. So we don't need to be too fussy at the moment, we're just kind of giving ourselves an idea of where we want the different colours to be dropped in. And remember, we're just using our photograph as a guide. It doesn't have to be absolutely photo accurate. It's just an idea of where we're going to be placing our colours. I'm just letting that settle in, and you can see me here. I've added another layer of that ruby red mix to the little petal that's in shadow there, whilst I was waiting for that to dry. And I'm using the mix of that lovely pink tone to go on the outside edge of this petal where you can see that tiny little fold of that pink colour. And now I'm enhancing the shadow pink that we put in before. This is wet on dry, just by using the tip of my brush, and of course, as always, cleaning it in that tiny little puddle of water, patting it dry on my kitchen paper and blending it through like this. And we're building up the colours now on that little shadow that we have on this upper petal here. Because I did feel that I had that pink element, I'm using the pink tone for this. And once again, softening my outside edge by blending it through using my damp brush. So we're going back to wet on wet now that everything's dry to continue building up those colours. And you can see the colours that I'm selecting from my palette here, dropping them in like this. Notice how I'm using the tip of my brush once again to manipulate that colour where I want it to go, remembering to stay out of that light colour at the base of the petal, and using my synthetic brush to blend through. I'm just dropping in that yellow tone. As you can see, it's very subtle at the moment, but it just gives us a guide and tells us where we're going to be dropping the colour later on. I'm also putting a little bit of the yellow tone here. I just felt that I had a soft yellow hue there. Now I've mixed a thicker mix of sepia here, and I'm going to let that dry a little bit on my palette because that gives you better control of the paint. So we'll just let that settle in a minute, and while we're waiting for that to dry, I'm just applying the neutral tint to enhance some of the areas on the petals like this. At the moment they're looking too flat, so we need to add some darker values. So I'm applying the neutral tint to just enhance that shadow tone, and it's still a watery mix. We don't want it to look too false, we just want it to have that natural kind of shadow. I'm just blending it through as before by using my damp brush. Also applying this mix to this shadow colour here where we have that lovely pinky tone to make that shadow colour slightly darker. This is the darker sepia mix, and just blending it through. You can see I've just applied a tiny bit of paint and just using my damp brush to blend it through like this. I'm using some neutral tint to put some veining in and a little bit more shadow where needed, and this is a really watery mix. We want it to look really natural. Just working through the magnolia bit by bit. I felt at this point also that this little shadow here needed strengthening up a bit, so I'm just using the neutral tint with a tiny bit of sepia here and there. And because you can take your time with watercolour painting, there's no rush. You can leave it, you can go away, make a cup of tea or whatever, and just come back to it whenever you're ready to paint it. So there's no rushing. This is kind of like a learn to paint as you paint technique, and hopefully you're enjoying it at the same time. I did drop a tiny bit of that pinky tone as that colour was drying, because if you look at the reference photograph, you can see there's kind of like a reflection of that pink. So I just dropped that in at the same time, and I'm applying this neutral tint colour where I feel I want to just give a little bit more shadow here and there. So you can see I'm just continuing the process, working through the magnolia flower bit by bit. Going back to the center. Now there's a lot of detail here, and as I said, we're not going to be absolutely photo accurate. This is just to give the idea of there being some detail in the center. Now the sepia mix that we mixed earlier on has now dried off a little bit in the palette, which means we can control it better. You can use a smaller brush for this, but I did feel that the point of my number 5 round was fine enough to work around these areas, negatively painting around those stamen like this. Just using the tip of my brush. So So I've tried to sort of simplify it a little bit, just so that wherever level you're at, you can join in and enjoy this tutorial. So I'm just going to just drop in this colour here and there. And this is where I made that tiny little error earlier on, so we can just paint around that and just add a little bit of shadow. So I'm just dropping in that little mix of the sepia, as you can see, negatively painting around some of the shapes. And also using this opportunity to sharpen up any untidy edges. So I've now switched down to my number 2 brush because this has an even finer point, and I'm using a tiny bit of ruby red mixed with lemon yellow, and I'm just patting this in here and there. Some of the central part of this flower have more detail than others, but like I said, we're just giving the illusion of it being the centre of the flower. And I'm also taking this pink tone to the little fold here. I could have continued to use my number 5 round, it doesn't matter. Use any brush that you feel comfortable with that has a fine tip. Using the sepia mix here to add a little bit more detail to that shadow as it hits the base of the magnolia. So just continuing the process by adding that sepia mix in between the little folds of the centre of the flower like this, working through bit by bit, and take your time. I'm using a tiny bit of sepia on the yellow area that we painted in earlier on, just to give a little bit of detail in between the folds. And I'm also using this opportunity to sharpen up any outside edges. I'm just dropping in a tiny bit more of that yellow tone, as you can see, with a tiny bit more sepia. I'm picking up some of that orangey tone and just painting over a glaze where we put that yellow tone earlier on. It was just looking that tiny bit too yellow, so by glazing over with the orange tone we've softened that through and just adding a bit more detail to the petals, as you can see here, and that tiny little fold that we have there, and also a little bit of detail on this little petal on the bottom. Adding some veins. This is just a watery mix of the sepia colour with a tiny bit of ruby red, but you could just use a watered down version of sepia, or indeed the neutral tint. So just sharpening up some edges here with the sepia mix where I made my little error and just adding a little bit of neutral tint to add some shadow. Dropping in a tiny bit of that ruby red. And sharpening up any edges that feel a little bit untidy. I'm dropping in a tiny bit of sepia to the outside edge of this petal because I really wanted it to look, I wanted it to have a little bit more definition. So I'm just dropping in that thicker mix of sepia and blending it through. And also adding sepia to this tiny area here. And using the opportunity to give those outside edges a tiny bit more sharpness and definition. Dr. P.H. Martin's Bleed Proof White is what I'm mixing now. If you don't have this colour, if you don't have this, then you could use something like a white gouache or even Chinese white, something like that that you have within your kit, or you don't have to use it at all. I bought this recently and I really love using it for smaller little small highlights. And you can see me here using the tip of my tiny little brush to add some, just a little bit of detail here and there. I have tried using white paint that you get within your paint sets sometimes. You have Chinese white, or I can't remember the other colour white that you have, but sometimes you need to mix it quite thick to get a sort of really opaque mix, and I found that it doesn't really work that well. But this Dr. P.H. Martin's Bleed Proof White is perfect for adding tiny little details here and there, as you can see here. So I'm just using the tip of my tiny little brush to create some curves. Now I know in real life in this photograph that the little bits that I'm painting in here are actually yellow, but I found that this really sort of gave them a little bit of a lift. I ought to mention actually that this little palette that I'm using from Etcher does actually come as a set of two. This is the other one that comes in the little tin that I have here. And I'm thinking maybe I should have used the other one because I'm running out of space here. But in case it's something that interests you, I didn't mention it at the start, but I will link it in the description box underneath this video. They are a little bit on the pricey side, but I really love them. So I thought you might want to have a look at that anyway. So now that that white is dry, I'm just outlining it with that sepia mix that's now dried up on the palette. What I'm doing here is painting negatively between those little gaps that we have within the white paint, just to outline them and give them a little bit more sort of clarity and a little bit more definition. So I'm just using that sepia mix to outline all those little areas that we painted in with the Bleed Proof White. So I'm doing the same with the elements that we painted in earlier with that pink mix, just to give them more definition as before. You can see that by doing this, it really gives it a little bit more definition, working in between those tiny little shapes. Okay, so at this point, it's just a case of repeating the process and tidying up any edges. So I'm going to stop talking and let you watch the rest of this tutorial in peace. Remember to stay right until the end because I will put the line drawing up at the end of this tutorial, and I'll also put a playlist so that you can click through and watch that as well. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.